because we're able to point to 5 other tests that he left out which show no narrowing. So if you average the 3 tests that he claims there's a narrowing on, of black-white differences, and the 5 tests in which there's no narrowing, the narrowing amounts to absolutely, at most, about 2 IQ points, which is complete. I mean, on an 80% heritability, we would actually expect at some point 3 or 4 IQ point conversions due to cultural factors. So that's well within our 80% heritability. But that's probably getting too technical. Paul?
Yes, Professor Rushton, the IQ ranking that you pointed out is black at the bottom, white, and then slightly ahead of the whites, the Asiatics. And yet, in terms of scientific achievements and civilization, black at the bottom, but probably a flip. Whites at the top and the Asiatics somewhat below. Are the IQ statistics for Asiatics taken across the board, or would they be mostly from the more educated and more intelligent Orientals that we've come in contact with, for instance, in Hong Kong or overseas Chinese in North America?
Well, that's a very good question, and it does appear that is one of the anomalies that needs to be explained. The answer to the question is it's across the board. Even in Canada, Philip Vernon, who was a very famous psychometrician 30 or 40 years ago, came to Canada, got a job at Calgary, and became very interested in Oriental IQ, East Asian IQ. His first approach to it was to go to all the small towns out in the prairies, where there was Chinese had helped build the Canadian Pacific Railway all the way out, laborers, all the way out to Vancouver. And then they had settled in certain places, their children had gone to school, little tiny villages really. And so he would go through the old school records, which are usually bundled up in the basement somewhere, and he'd go through and he'd look for the Chinese names. And what he found was, and these are children of Chinese laborers, what he would find was that they were always above average. And it was like 20 or 30 of these schools. They're always above average. Didn't really make much sense. And then he started to look at all the data in North America, and he consistently found that they were, maybe they were a little bit below average, but if they were a little bit below average, then it was, they were really living in very deprived environments. But today, to cut a long story short, there have been at least 8 major standardizations of IQ tests in China. There have been 2 or 3 done in Japan. Even the first standardization in Japan, which was done in 1954, they took an American test, they went to Japan, they tested everybody there, they normed it, they wanted to select people for schools and the military and so on. It was American occupation, of course. And what they found was not only are there about 7 IQ points ahead of whites in North America, but even the 45-year-old group in Japan, these were a group that had grown to maturity in the 20s and 30s, when in Japan there was tremendous depression. There was no meat, no protein, it was all rice diet. But even the 45-year-olds had a slightly higher IQ. So these tests have been re-standardized in, as I say, Japan. There are samples from Singapore, all kinds of places, and it's just consistent. The lowest IQ score was one big standardization in China, which is 101. The highest was 111, and that was in Japan. And most of them center on about 105 or 106.
On the issue of spouses and best friends, I'm a bipolar. A lot of people in my family are bipolars, and I married a bipolar. Do you know if any psychologists looked at the specific issue? Are we actually subconsciously recognizing each other? And like you say, picking for just specific on the bipolar
yes,
phenomenon.
There is a lot of, not a lot, but a certain amount of research on psychiatric disorders. People used to argue about disordered mating. They would say, well, the best get the best, and the rest get what's left. And that people who have psychiatric problems are sort of like at the bottom of the pool in their choices. because people don't want to marry people with psychiatric problems. That's why people with psychiatric problems marry other people with psychiatric problems or whatever. But then you go and you look at a finer grain analysis, and what you find is that bipolars marry bipolars, depressed people marry depressed people, schizophrenics marry schizophrenics, criminals marry criminals, mentally retarded prefer mentally retarded. So there's even selection within this particular sample.
Could you off the top of your head point me to a particular psychologist's name
No.
that you're thinking?
But if you Google in
Okay.
the terms assortative mating,
Assortative?
mating,
Okay.
marriage, assortative, just put in psychiatric marriage.
Okay.
And you know, you'll have to play with words like that and go to Google Scholar.
Google Scholar.
Google Scholar, and you'll find whatever the studies for the most recent ones are.
Well, thank you. I was beginning to suspect it myself.
Yes, I was quite impressed with that statistic you mentioned about similarity, genetic similarity and its correspondence with nationalism. Since about the late 80s, I have lived about 70% of my time in Asia, primarily the Far East, as with the Defense Department first, and now as a university teacher in China primarily, from Manchuria clear down almost to Vietnam. So any Orientals you see with a southern accent are probably my alumni. The Chinese, as far as I gather, ethnically they're about 94% Han, 6% Manchu. So therefore, very genetically similar. Now in 1989 was the Defense Department, the Tiananmen uprising occurred. People predicted the Communist Party in China was doomed. It had no support. But then they made an about face. Instead of emphasizing communism, they're still titularly communists, but they emphasized nationalism. And I see in all the universities, and I've taught in about 8 universities, this really resonates with the young Chinese. They care nothing about communism, but they are dedicated to nationalism, making China a great power, doing whatever it takes. And it seems to have resonated with the Chinese in Taiwan and those in America, but, according to the intelligence scandals we've had over here. Do you attribute that nationalism primarily to the genetic similarity? That seems to me my cursory observation, though I've made no study on it.
No, I think that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and you know, under the communists, they were supposed to be internationalists, but under Stalin, when he needed to fight the Great Patriotic War against Hitler, he appealed to nationalism and patriotism. It's just very motivating.
Right. Thank you.
I noticed you cited a bunch in your presentations of sociobiologists, and they were Dawkins, Wilson, Hamilton, Rushton, and Salter. And from what I would guess, they're Gentile by nature. And I was wondering if, in a sense, that there's an underrepresentation of Jews as sociobiologists, and this kind of validates Kevin MacDonald's argument that they don't want to steal anthropology or science towards a white Gentile ethnic nationalism. And so they're kind of standing in the way of science and objective science. Would you say that?
There are definitely well-known Jewish sociobiologists. Robert Trivers is probably the most famous. He's now at, he was at Harvard at the time of E.O. Wilson. He's now at Rutgers, New Jersey. David Barash is another Jewish sociobiologist. I don't know what the frequencies are. It may be, you're right, that it is slightly underrepresented. Certainly, I think even before the Hitler era, Jewish psychologists tended not to be as enthusiastic about Darwinism and sociobiology